Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're watching from. I'm Steve Ross. I'm Distinguished Professor of History at USC, and I'm the director of the Kasdan Institute for the Study of the Jewish Role in American Life. And I welcome you today to our Kasdan conversation on a history of Jews in science. This event had originally been scheduled for the fall term, but given the tragic events that have occurred in Israel, we decided it would be far more appropriate to reschedule it for this spring. And our event today will be a panel discussion featuring several of the contributors to Volume 20 of the Kasdan Annual called Jews and Science. And we are thrilled to welcome our guest editor today, Dr. Sander Gilman, to serve as the moderator for our program. Now, the question of Jews and science examines the complicated relationship between Jewish identity and the evolving meaning of various sciences. And throughout the history of Western academic culture, Jews have been the subject of examination by, quote, scientists, from biology to bioethics to anthropology and genetics. And volume 20, which you can get on Amazon, or you can go to the Purdue University Press website and get it for free on open access. You can get any of the articles or the entire volume you can download. And today's issues are going to examine some of those essays. And our format is going to be, our panelists will have a discussion for roughly an hour, and that'll leave us with around a half hour for your questions. During the panel, if you have a question, please go to your chat room, write into the chat box, write the question in, and I will pose the questions to our panelists once we enter that phase of today's discussion. Now, our moderator, Sander Gilman, is Distinguished Professor of the Liberal Arts and Sciences, as well as Professor of Psychiatry at Emory University, where he's the director of the program in psychoanalysis and at the Health Sciences Humanities Initiative. Sander is a cultural and literary historian, the author of over, I'm just exhausted even citing this, 80 books, and including Disease and Diagnoses, a recent edited volume, Race in Contemporary Medicine, Biological Facts and Fictions. He's also the author of a basic study of the visual stereotyping of the mentally ill called Seeing the Insane, as well as a standard and well-known study, Jewish Self-Hatred. For 25 years, he was a member of the Humanities and Medical Facility at Cornell University, where he held the Goldwin Smith Professorship in Humane Studies. For 6 years, he held the Henry Luce Distinguished Science Professorship in Liberal Arts and Human Biology at the University of Chicago. And for 4 years, he was Distinguished Professor of the Liberal Arts and Medicine and creator of the Humanities Lab at the University of Chicago, Illinois, or University of Illinois, Chicago. And now, without further ado, I welcome Sander Gilman to introduce our distinguished panelists for today's discussion. Sander, over to you.
Thank you very much, Steve. And I want to thank the colleagues at University of Southern California for enabling this conversation. I mean, it's going to be interesting, we hope. The speakers today, I'm going to introduce sort of one remove, if I may. Can I have the first slide, please? Purdue University Press. This means you can download the whole volume or any essay in it for free. And that's really quite important in terms of being able to disseminate the sort of scholarship, the sort of first-rate scholarship that is included in this volume. The next slide, please. The volume is available, however, also as a book. some of you remember books. And that I think you can get through Amazon with this lovely, if complicated cover. Next slide, please. The table of contents, I'm going to sort of go through, and I will introduce the speakers today when I talk about their contributions. Next slide, please. Covered a series of problems. The first one was the question of what is science? And perhaps even more importantly, who are Jews? Are they the ones doing the science? Are they the ones the subject of the science? Are they the ones who reject notions of science? And we have 4 extremely important essays, one by Susanna Heschel at Dartmouth on gender, one by Steve Gimbel and Stephen Stern on Jewish philosophers of science debating notions of objectivity. Can Jews be objective in science? Robert Jutte, one of the great medical historians of our day, on whether or not the history of medicine has become a kind of a blank spot within Jewish studies. And then Mitch Ash from Vienna reworked an extremely important essay of his on Jews and scientists in Vienna from the end of the 19th through the beginning of the 20th century, which not only asks the question of what is science and who are the Jews, but how did that work in a specific time and a specific place? Next slide, please. Human biology has always been a topic, certainly over the last 30 years. Looking now at race theory and genetics, and we have both of the speakers today who've written on in this section, Mitch Hart at the University of Florida and Julia Govra from Durham University. Both of them, as you well know, if you've read in this area, have contributed major work to this question of, is there, for example, Jewish genetics? What does it mean to talk about Jewish genetic diseases? Can you think about tracing being Jewish genetically, as, by the way, the chief Sephardi rabbi of Israel now has claimed? Now, can I have the next slide, please? One of the things that has happened in Jewish studies, certainly over the last decade, is the rise of Israel studies. I was going to say as an ancillary, but now today, really after October the 7th, as the primary focus of Jewish studies. And we have both of the authors in this section, Amos Moses Boris Reich from Tel Aviv University, and myself, Amos, writing about the, can we say, the embeddedness of science in early Zionism and on. And my essay is a kind of an odd contribution, because one of the things that arose during COVID, you remember COVID, right? Was the fact that Israel became the laboratory for the study of COVID. And that notion of Jews being the subject of the laboratory has its own complicated history, not just in the Third Reich, but especially in the history of Zionism and the history of the state of Israel. Next slide, please. Dean Bell, who is president of Spertus University in Chicago, is one of the people who has started work on whether or not the new environmental history, again, we've been doing environmental history since Ariel and the 1940s, 30s, and 40s. But now we really do have environmental history as a kind of a sub-field, a recognized sub-field of general history. And that question now of Jews as the subject, Jews as the actors, becomes a real question in the new environmental history. The other contributor to this section is a graduate student at Oxford by the name of Nettle Cohen, who is working exactly on this question of Zionism and climatology. This understanding of where Jews live, how they live. Because remember, Renan said that Jews were racially a people of the desert. What does that mean when one starts to think of this in science? Next slide, please. The volume ends with two contributions, one by David Hollinger, the great historian of science at Berkeley, thinking about his own career writing about Jews in science. And because Steve recognizes in the introduction to this volume the question about the preeminence of Jews within Nobel prizes, a very contentious topic, which I addressed many years ago in my book called Smart Jews, The Myth of Jewish Superior Education, of its Jewish intelligence. One of the people who has contributed to the volume is my dear friend Roald Hoffman, winner of the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, but also somebody who has thought deeply about what it means to have that question of Jews and science linked, Jews and science separated, Jews and science thought about. I'm going to turn this over now to each of the subsequent panelists whom I've introduced now, who will give short conversation starters about their work in the volume and about their work in general. So I'm going to start with Mitch Hart.
Right. I'm sorry. I apologize. Thank you, Sander. It's a great pleasure to participate in this and to have contributed to the volume. Thank you. My essay is on something that I call geneticism, and it is an exploration of the narratives of history, the history of belonging and community using genetics. Okay, but it's not genetics. I want to be very clear that it's not an exploration. I'm not equipped to, I presented some version of this at 2 conferences and got screamed at by geneticists who for some reason wandered into a history conference and didn't quite understand what historians actually do. It's not about genetics. It's about the narratives that Jews, Jewish scientists, writers use, or narratives that they construct using genetics. And so it's on, the focus is on the temporal, really, and the search for genetic links between ancient Israel and contemporary Jews. Again, caveat, I am not at all talking about Jews in medicine here. I have absolutely nothing to say about the reality of genetics, the truth of genetics, and the use of genetics medically by Jews. This completely different topic. It's the politics of genetics, especially when the attempt is, for example, all the studies done that Yulia has talked about in her essay, the studies done about Kohanim and the Levite elites in ancient Israel, and trying to establish this temporal and even spatial connection over long stretches of time. And it simply asks, one question is, what does it mean when Jews today want to embrace this sort of genetic narrative? What do they get out of it? What does it bring? That's what interests me. It's not challenging the truth of genetics. Believe me, that's the last thing I would ever attempt to do. So these are historical and cultural questions about contemporary Jewry. And it seems to me that one question is this an American phenomenon, or can we find this transnationally? And if it's an American phenomenon, the ancestry obsession, then what does that say about the American Jewish community? The essay also explores continuities and discontinuities because the main focus of my work over the past 30 years or so has been earlier, and it was the racialization and self-racialization of Jews, largely in Europe, but also the United States. So the continuities and the discontinuities between the early 20th century self-racialization and this sort of embrace today of a biological determinism when it comes to identity. There are continuities, there are discontinuities. The continuities, I think, have to do with Zionism. They have to do with this attempt to connect ancient and contemporary Jews with the land and with the people. The discontinuities, I think, and this is where I'll end, are if not more fascinating. And I would say the biggest one has to do with Jewish institutional and discursive power and a political and cultural insider status that Jews today in America and elsewhere have that they obviously didn't have in the early 20th century, even in the United States or the United Kingdom. And that, of course, means an enormous amount. It's not everything, but of course, as Sander, together with Nancy Steppen, pointed out years ago in their seminal essay, who controls the discourse on this and what it means to be a minority and to talk about science is extraordinarily important. And Jews can now not just create discourses, but they can challenge negative ones, all the things that Sander already talked about years ago, that minorities, Jews, Blacks and others, women, what they couldn't do when they were locked out of academia and did not have the same access to scientific journals and conferences, Jews, of course, have been able to do now for over half a century. So that seems to me to be an enormous discontinuity. And that was certainly what my essay was seeking to at least explore. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mitch. Julia, you want to pick that up?
Yes, certainly. Thank you very much indeed, of course, to Professor Sander Gilman and to the organizers for inviting me to join this discussion. And what I'm going to say very much builds on what the previous speaker, Professor Hart, has just said, was referring to Professor Gilman's work too. So what I tried to do in my chapter is, again, focus on research of geneticists who identify as Jewish, and look at the possible motivations for conducting research, specifically trying to reconstruct the history of Jewish migration, as well as on the responses of different Jewish publics to this research, again, asking very much the same questions that Mitch has just noted. What would motivate people, communities, again, sometimes on an individual level, sometimes on a broader level, to engage with genetic research? And what I tried to do in my chapter to probably, I would say, put in a conversation with each other two bodies of literature in anthropology and in the history of genetic research. One is literature exploring the sociocultural dimensions of genetic research into Jewish history specifically, and another one is social scientific studies of genomic mapping exercises conducted outside the context of Western Europe and North America. And in this respect, I was very much inspired by the work of my colleague, Dr. Ernesto Schwarz-Marin, who conducted an ethnography of one such initiative in Mexico, where the organizers developed the concept of genomic sovereignty as a concept of, say, a country, a state in this case, trying to protect their genomic makeup of its population, but also protect a particular narrative of its history. And so in my chapter, I tried, in a sense, to do two things, and my argument is somewhat twofold. So first, I suggested that the case of genetic research conducted among Jewish communities and individuals highlights how prominent these discourses of sovereignty and subalternity have become at all levels of collective and individual genetic history knowledge production, from nationwide exercises in genomic mapping to individual pursuits of DNA ancestry testing. And again, what I suggested, and Mitch's paper very much speaks to these issues too, is that it appears that those studies that were conducted by scientists who identify as Jewish and explicitly state the objective of their work was to help their community, to improve healthcare, or to support a particular historical narrative, could also be conceptualized as an example of researchers pursuing a project akin to the efforts of scientists and officials in different parts of the world to preserve and protect national genomes, even if one could say that oftentimes these national genomes are perceived as national. Secondly, I argued that it is not only the work of Jewish geneticists who initiated and conducted these studies that could be considered through the prism of these particular theoretic insights on genomic sovereignty, but also that the responses of multiple Jewish publics who have deployed knowledge stemming from genetics to propose and defend their own genealogies and notions of belonging could also be seen as an example of an attempt to achieve genomic sovereignty and to take control of a particular narrative and a form of self-identification. And in this respect, I consider a number of examples. One of them stems from my prior research on the Bnei Ephraim, formerly Dalit community in Andhra Pradesh in South India, who sought to have genetic tests kind of conducted among them and to be able to prove their Israelite descent. And kind of my broader theoretical argument that I tried to put forward in this and in some of my previous publications is that on the one hand, we can certainly see how genetic research does have this liberatory, almost empowering potential, but at the same time, we shouldn't be losing track of the question of who gets to have their genetic stories heard. And again, my conclusion here was partly that it looks a lot that this very desire to affirm preferred modes of self-identification through genetics is still a symptom of much wider socio-political tendencies that privilege more kind of naturalist biologized accounts of human difference. And I think I'll stop here just with this summary.
Thank you so much, Julia. Amos, can I turn it over to you and put your mic on?
Yeah. So first of all, I want to thank you, Sander and Steve, for including me both in the volume and in today's discussion. And I want to say that the volume is great. So I definitely don't want people who are seeing us today to listen to us instead of reading. It's an invitation to reading the volume. So I want to say a few words about my contribution, which I wrote together with Danny Trom, who is a sociologist from Paris. And we wrote about the relationship between Zionism and science in the first 2 decades of the Zionist movement. So the background of the discussion, there's a question which actually I think goes even into the background of the events of the 7th of October attack. About how much the legacy of the first 2 decades of Zionism and science is still relevant for understanding Israeli society today, and I'd say I think it still is. So as a modern project, Zionism has a strong relationship to science, basically like all modern national movements. But the relationship is singular in certain respects. And in the article, we argue that the relationship was established with the very inception of the Zionist movement, so the very beginning. The second thing is that it's characterized by a duality. There's a highly pragmatic attitude, a scientific attitude, as actually science is engineering in a certain way, seen as the instrument of national construction, and science as working at the same time with the most fragile and inaccessible building blocks, and towards a goal which always remains vague. And the ultimate goal is never fully specified, but remains utopian and unstated. And we think it's very, very important for understanding this kind of the core of the fusion of science and Zionism in these first 2 decades. To reconstruct the status of science, we read Herzl's Judenstaat and Altneuland, the 2 most important books he wrote in relation to Zionism. And then we focus on Zionism's movement's expert journal, which was also called Altneuland, after Herzl's novel. And then we exemplify this duality with the roles of the sociologist Franz Oppenheimer and the demographer and functionary Arthur Ruppin. In a way, the article tries to reconstruct the realism and the idealism in this fusion of science and Zionism in the first 2 decades of the Zionist movement. I can't go through the demonstration, but a quotation from the historian, actually the person who co-established the institute in which I teach now, the Korn Institute for History and Philosophy of Science in Tel Aviv University, captures our direction. And he says, this is from Amos Funkenstein, and he says, I quote, "Without science and technology, such was the almost general consensus among Zionists, there can be no normalization." Normalization, he means, of the Jewish people. It is indeed a telling point that all the dreams of Herzl in his Altneuland, the most daring technological ones, were those realized nearly in their entirety. The book reminds us of Jules Verne's Electric City, end quote. So when we read the journal, it is in order to explore the way this imaginary construct was concretized. We look at the different layers of concretization towards a construction of a society. The main thing that we found when reading the journal is that the sciences that were involved in this project were all-inclusive, from very, very practical fields such as financing, water management, agricultural techniques, but also really esoteric ones such as folklore and ethnography. Science is all the disciplines taken together, made coherent by a network of experts. I will not go into the details of Oppenheimer and Ruppin. I will only note that what the roles reveal is both this duality of engineering and idealism, as well as the significance of science. Science is the most powerful instrument at the disposal of the Zionist movement. Thank you. You're muted. Sander, you're muted.
You see, I warn people to unmute, and I don't unmute myself. I love technology. I'm taking 2 minutes because what Mitch, Julia, and Amos now have said picks up a distinction that I pick up in my essay about COVID-19 and Israel as laboratory. Because the difference between early Zionism and science has to do with the notion that Jews, in complicated ways, were still kind of almost standing outside of, even though they were being admitted to. And Zionism demanded that they be admitted and that science become an objective way, right, of thinking about the new Jewish state. What Mitch points out is that when you start to get to the 21st century, things have turned around completely. And Israel, at the time of COVID, is the ultimate modern entrepreneurial state. And the notion that Israel then becomes a kind of testing ground, both for new modes of dealing with COVID, vaccines, especially the newest mRNA vaccines, and the public health claims of being able to intervene, means that Israel has a very special place. And I think it's a very problematic place because it asks questions about whether or not, for example, the COVID-19 uncovered a kind of deep anti-science quality, not just of Israel, but of the West. It asks questions about what it means in a society that arises after the Holocaust, after the doctors' trials, about informed consent, whether or not such a society has different relationships to science. What I found was that Israel was just like every other society of the West, and therefore inherently different from every society in the West. I had fun with the essay. Dean, I'll turn it over to you and environmental history.
Well, thanks, Sander, and everyone else. I'm delighted to be invited to participate with all of my distinguished colleagues and everyone that's joined us, both in the volume, but as well as in today's program. I wanted to begin with a bit of a story. Since I'm a historian, I like to do that in some cases, and some of you will recognize this sort of trajectory. I recall in the early 90s when I was working on my dissertation, I was reading a lot of German chronicles, and I had particular thematic and disciplinary blinders on. I suppose those were firmly affixed, as they often are in our work. And as I was reading these chronicles, looking for discussions of Jews, I didn't really pay much attention to anything else, though I did note out of the corner of my eye that there were significant discussions of issues like weather and natural disasters, but who could be concerned with such things when there was other stuff to work on? Years later, when I was reading about the Little Ice Age and some really interesting scholarship that had been done in Germany, and stumbling across an event of the flooding of some major rivers in Germany in the late 18th century, I came across several chronicles, news reports, sermons, community ledgers, and other sources, including material sources and visual sources. And as I thought about the events that were being described in the 18th century, as well as the earlier ones that I had seen, I began to wonder about how I could use different lenses and methodologies to understand and evaluate these events. Of course, as a Jewish studies scholar and as a historian, I was interested in the impact of the events on the Jewish communities, and I suppose as a proxy for other religious groups and humanities more generally. I knew that environmental history might look at the events from a different perspective, sometimes scientific, but as Sander suggested, the new environmental history is far more than that as well, with different interests and different goals. And the two fields in some ways might be placed into a fruitful conversation, but certainly might have different inflection points as well. Given the scale and nature of the flooding, it seemed reasonable to conclude that the clues and the methods for interpreting historical, and I would say contemporary events as well, could and probably need to be found across disciplines. And so, of course, I consider the benefits of environmental history and Jewish studies together. In my contribution to the volume, I explored the emergence of environmental history and Jewish studies, pointing to some similar contexts in their development, particularly in the 60s and 70s, as well as the areas of emphasis and the approach that they take. And I suggested that there were ways in which these two disciplines might enrich the work of each other. So taking these two together, I think allowed a number of things. One was to see a diversified and expanded range of historical sources. And by that, I mean both the historical texts, written texts and visual texts, but also nature's archives, as we've come to call them. And by combining these, we often had an opportunity to look in a more nuanced way into various aspects of daily life, while also at the same time showcasing some broader changes in perspectives and behaviors, particularly over periods of time. This is something that's become particularly acute to me as I've read other environmental historians who are thinking about the varieties of temporalities that we address, particularly in dealing with ecological and environmental issues, when they're in conversation with sociological, religious, and cultural definitions and developments as well. It also gave us the opportunity to look at the responses to nature and natural disasters, including both practical, technological, and policy ones, but also religious, cultural, and social perspectives in the ways of perceiving and understanding the broader world. It gave us an opportunity, I think, to see both particularism and universalism overlap and diverge in some really interesting ways. Now, most of the essay was really about the sort of background of environmental history through the 1960s, particularly as it engaged with other new histories and forms of scholarship, but also as it addressed questions of policy and power in the broader community, notions of interdisciplinarity, overlapping timeframes, and the construct that environment and environmental history are themselves part of. Explore the nature of the implications of the cultural lenses and responses that overlaid much of the environmental historical work, as well as the emphasis on senses, perceptions, and experiences, oftentimes with a postmodern focus on language and narratives, a theme that I've heard already with some of my other colleagues. Again, the sources are pretty broad. And then when I compare them to Jewish studies developing around the same time, at least in its modern form, not in its Wissenschaft form, thinking about the variety of approaches and methodologies that have been used as well to allow us a sort of diversity of definitions of what we even mean by Judaism and Jewish studies, what are the essentialisms, how do we think about hybridity, but also a variety of different contexts. I suppose in this regard, the postmodern and post-colonial key of polemics and the role and voice of minorities was really particularly interesting as we thought about both micro and macro narratives that have emerged, particularly around natural history and natural disasters. And of course, Jewish studies is both interdisciplinary, as I think Sander has pointed out, transdisciplinary in really significant and telling ways, and allows us to see a sort of diversity of local and global concerns. Both environmental history and Jewish studies often seem to me to raise the questions of rupture, particularly in a modern period. And so lots of interesting things emerge from this comparison of environmental and history and Jewish studies that allowed me then to sort of reframe the discussion of the flood event, which I return to at the end of the essay. And in that regard, I think it gave us an opportunity to think not only with different lenses, but to see the impact and the response in very different kinds of ways, both within and beyond the Jewish community, to think about ways that different people responded in terms of the technical and political and policy ways, but also in terms of their sort of cultural worldviews. And so more to say about that, but just to suggest that placing environmental history and the sort of science, but also the new environmental component into conversation with Jewish history and Jewish studies proves to be fruitful, I think gives us an opportunity to think differently with many of the events and the sources that we have.
Thank you, Dean. What we've heard now are kind of traces of really, really rich essays. I'm going to ask some questions because one of the things, Amos, that you did, which I think is right, is to say, hey, science isn't just biology, right? You know, and both Yulia and Dean have really stressed this, which is, hey, when we start to think about science, which is, of course, a construct that grows more and more out of the academy, right? What is science is something that has a kind of new cultural value, right? I mean, in the 19th century, certainly Dilthey is quite happy to think about the humanities as a science, right? Geisteswissenschaft, right? Today, the humanities has minus cultural value, but science still does. And it strikes me that looking at the social sciences, right, the natural sciences, in this new way in the 21st century, raises really interesting questions, not only about what the scientists do, but what we do as humanists, right? I mean, Mitch, you started out, you covered your butt elegantly by saying, hey, I don't do the science, man. I just don't do the science. I am merely a historian, right? But it strikes me, and I want to open it to all of you. What is that type of a critique of science, both in the past, but also in the present, the sort of thing that we do when we start to look at the 21st century, say about our positionality as scientists, right? As historians. Mitch, I'm going to throw it over, but I'm going to stick you with it.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to, because I'll give you the little story, and that is that I presented this a longer version of this, a paper at the American Historical Association meeting a couple of years ago, and got done. Pretty much just read a 20-minute version of this on what I was calling geneticism, and as I said, half of the audience seemed to have been geneticists who, for some reason, wandered into the hotel and decided to attend this panel, but were not comfortable. And so immediately one stood up, a gentleman who I later learned is one of the leading geneticists in the UK. And he said, listen, genetics is true, and that's all you people need to know. And he sat down. And half the audience clapped and sort of echoed this. And my response was, look, I'm not a geneticist. I never claimed to be. So one woman yelled out, well, what are you doing on stage? If you're not a geneticist, why are you talking about this? So I think you're pointing to one, I was going to ask Amos, or raise the question, definitions of science change over time, and they change within different academic communities. Clearly, humanists are not supposed to speak to scientists or about science. We know this historically. This was already the case when Thomas Kuhn's book came out, and Foucault. We know the reaction among scientists to the idea that science is a construct. Many of them get very, very upset about this idea because it seems to challenge the reality and truth of science. So one, we might want to talk more about what we mean by science. So as Dean just said, Wissenschaft is very expansive in the 19th century. Everybody knows this. And it seems to have narrowed over time. So what we mean by science today, we should talk more about and maybe try to define more clearly. But the reason that I said what I said was merely from experience of having given this talk and been yelled at by geneticists who seem very uncomfortable with the notion that genetics can be talked about in any other way than simply, it's true. And my response is yes, but every scientific community, including the racialists that I studied, of course they talked about this. They didn't describe their work as pseudoscience. That would have been ridiculous. They were scientists, and they believed in the truth and reality of what they studied. Even from our perspective, much of it looks completely ridiculous and dangerous today. That, to me, seems to be central to what we're doing, is trying to get to sort of the epistemological status that we're faced with when it comes to genetics, for example. That's all.
Well, I can tell you, if you think facing an audience which is half geneticists is scary, try doing grand rounds in the Department of Psychiatry today.
Right. Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Julia, I mean, you're an anthropologist and you work in communities that, where the physical anthropologists, right, want these people to be the new Jews, at least some physical anthropologists, right? How does one deal with thinking about genetics and identity separate from genetics and science? Because, I can make any claim, we do all the time, about inheriting a tradition, right? That's, for me, my favorite example always was the discovery of hidden Jews in the American Southwest in the 1960s and 70s, people who celebrated the Sabbath, right? Who avoided eating pork. And it turns out that they were, in point of fact, people who in the 1920s and 30s had been converted to Seventh-day Adventists and then moved back to Catholicism, maintaining a kind of underground identity, right? Not as Jews, but now there was status to being crypto-Jews, right? They're going to build a museum to you. So what happens in South Asia?
Yeah, thank you very much, Sander, for this question. And to go back to your question about what does our critique of science tell us about us as scientists, it immediately made me think about genetic research on different communities in South Asia and the global South more broadly that try to deploy genetics to reconstruct sort of hidden histories or prove and disprove identities. I'm talking here about genetic research aimed at reconstructing the history of human migrations. And as Mitch has pointed out, I think absolutely correctly in his contribution, that it's important to distinguish between this research and medical research. And when it comes to us social anthropologists critiquing that kind of genetic research, sort of historical genetic research, research in biological anthropology that tries to address historical questions, then we oftentimes critique it as just a particular narrative that is not in any way superior to the narratives and accounts of identity of the communities where this research was conducted. Or for instance, Noah Markin in his book on the Lambda and DNA research has argued that, yes, what geneticists produced there was specific theorizations of Jewish identity and Jewish history in the context of South Africa, which were not in any way superior to the theorizations of the members of the community themselves. And I would say that this, when I hear this argument, of course, I can't help asking myself, like, what would be the status of the theorizations that we in social anthropology produce in relation to the accounts of the people we study? Because again, as Michael Herzfeld has pointed out famously, our research participants are just as capable of doing theory as we are in social anthropology and social sciences more broadly. So I would say that the question that you posed is absolutely spot on in the sense that it invites us to reflect on our own position as scientists in social sciences and the humanities.
And of course, again, as has been pointed out, we are now in complicated ways in the United States and in the UK in a post-October 7th moment where notions of what is indigenous all of a sudden has a whole different set of meanings. And while here I am happy to be corrected, while I've not yet seen genetic/biological arguments about who are the real indigenous people in the Middle East, they cannot be far from the moment. They really cannot be far from the moment, right? Because one of the things that genetics claims, and I say claims, I'm not saying it's wrong, is that it can judge temporality, right? So when you do genetics today, you're not just doing genetics of the moment, but you then can do genetics of the past. And the question is how far in the past you can do those genetics. People doing ecological genetics claims that they can do it now 2 million years ago. Statement of fact, that's the claim. Amos, how do we do this? How do we talk in ways that make sense as humanists about now the claims of science in its claims on objectivity and constructing realities?
Yeah. Well, actually, first of all, I actually want to return the question to Mitch. But before this, I find it very, very interesting that in this panel conversation on Jews and science, we find ourselves, first of all, speaking about science as being constructed and not about Jewish identities as being constructed. So that this is our entry into this. I'm actually very, very curious, Mitch, if you could tell us more about what do you think it is that irritated or disturbed the geneticists during your lecture?
Right. So, yeah, I think it's a fascinating point you just made. They were not disturbed about the notion that Jewish identity is constructed. I think maybe we all take that for granted now that identities are constructed, even as they are insisting, as all of this material that we're dealing with is insisting that it's biological or it's natural or organic. There are two different sort of discursive worlds working with one another, and they don't quite lock together. The geneticists are very, in the both of the audiences, they were very disturbed by the suggestion, and it was a misunderstanding on their part, I think, that I was suggesting that genetics is not real, that somehow I was equating it with early 20th century racial thinking, which I was not doing, except insofar as saying, I don't know, 200 years from now, even 100 years from now, academics and scientists will probably have a very different take on some aspect of this. But that, I think, was the disturbing aspect, that they thought I was trying to relativize genetics and to make it into something equatable with stories or with history. And God forbid science and history should be equated. And that's what I think disturbed them. They weren't disturbed by the Jewish part. They were disturbed by the idea that genetics is something that's malleable. And, I tried to explain, and I think that's what the short answer is. So,
Dean, I'm going to turn to you because this question now of nature has been raised over and over again. I mean, we speak of the Naturwissenschaften, right? I mean, nature. I mean, the Romantics' notion of nature starts to shape the notion of science in the, again, we always go back to Dilthey, but we don't have to, in the late 19th century. How much of this notion of an objectivity is built into the new environmental science, which I've always thought as being very political?
Yeah, no, Sandra, thanks for that. I think it is political in many ways, but I want to tie maybe a couple of points that have been made into this. You mentioned before this idea of indigenous knowledge. I sometimes think of the indigenous term, particularly in environmental studies, where we've gone back to look at different ways of knowing. And in some ways, we've sort of separated out artificially in much of our scholarship over the last century, the subjective and the objective. And in many ways, the indigenous turn allows us to take the subjective and objective back together again. And I think that is true also in a sort of phenomenological way as we think about the experience side of our knowledge, and not just what we know and what we speak, but actually how our senses function in the world. And so the new environmental history in some ways does bring that back together. I think the benefit of that is it dissolves all sorts of challenging boundaries between disciplines. It helps us think about change within how we think about the world and human knowledge. And if we had a notion that science was sort of regnant in objectivity back in the 19th and parts of the 20th century, I think much of that has been washed away. And even among scientists, maybe not the geneticists in this case, but other scientists, I think, are quite open to the notion that knowledge is, there are truths that we're after, but it is changeable as well. And I suppose the interesting then connection to the Jewish identity piece, because I think they are connected, is what makes somebody specifically Jewish, or how do we define Judaism? The postmodern turn has allowed us to question what the essentialisms are, right? Moshe Rossman at Bar-Ilan has raised the question of what we mean by Jewish, particularly in this postmodern world, and what are the essential things that we have, or how do we talk about Judaism as reflected in a particular context, or a particular way of knowing. And so from that standpoint, the definitions and the fluidity that we see both in many of the scientific areas, but also in Jewish studies and Jewish history, overlap in some interesting ways, and they cause some problems, right? If you can't define things in a essentialist way, how do you talk about them? And is everything so fluid that it's impossible to have any truths? Well, that's an interesting conversation to have both in the scientific as well as the humanities discourses. And maybe that's the opportunity to bring the two together, to think about those in a more holistic way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the core question about asking the relationship between Jews and science, which is, are we talking about fluid concepts, right? Which in their interrelationship, because they're both fluid, oftentimes mean very different things from the scientific perspective as from the quote unquote Jewish perspective. And I must admit, the penny dropped for me, oh, now it's got to be 10 years ago. We went to high holiday services at our shul. And because I'm so-called three-day Jews, right? So the Rosh Hashanah service is full. So you're not using the little chapel, but you're using the 2,000-seat auditorium from the 1920s. And on every seat, there's a little stack of papers, announcements. And I pick the stack up, and on the top is an ad for genetic testing for the quote-unquote Jewish genetic diseases. And I thought to myself, an interesting moment. I'm one who has always advocated genetic testing for everyone, right? Right? I think it's a good idea. But my God, all of a sudden, some company has realized that you can mine the Jewish community on Rosh Hashanah, right? And encourage people to get tested. Now, nothing against getting tested, but it struck me as a very odd juxtaposition of science, entrepreneurship, and religious practice.
Well, it's
Steve,
like those.
I think.
No, it's
Sorry.
like, do you remember the Haggadot that Maxwell House used to distribute? It's a very banal example.
Yes,
Right.
indeed. Absolutely. Absolutely. But I will remind you that the Hagganot were free with coffee.
That's
The genetic testing was not free.
true. Well, you had to buy the coffee.
That's true. That's true. Steve, we're now to 3 o'clock my time in DC, which I think is noon by you.
Yes, I need to unmute myself. So I want to remind the audience that please, I invite you to put your questions in the chat box. We have received a few, so let me throw one out. And the phrase, one of our audience members wrote the following, and I'm going to quote them: "Science," and this is picking up on something you all said, that science is a construct used by the human brain to explain what surrounds us and the universe. What exactly do we mean by science as a construct? For historians and social, sort of humanist, soft social scientists like me, we understand that gender is a construct. What it means to be a man or a woman is socially determined. How is science a construct? What I'm thinking of is, does this have anything to do with, Thomas Kuhn's argument in the structures of social, in scientific revolutions, that science is truth until it's no longer truth? What do we mean that science is a construct?
Well, let me just say, let me not go to Kuhn. Let me go to Kant, because
Okay.
Kant in the struggle of the faculties points out, because it starts in the Enlightened University before Humboldt, right before Humboldt. Suddenly you start getting at disciplines. And then in Humboldt's university, you start to get sub-disciplines. And then you get sub-disciplines in the sub-disciplines. That is, science as we think about it today is a construct because the way it evolves over time undermines the premises in which it exists at any given moment. And one real quick question. When I was at Cornell, one of our great friends was Tom Eisner. Tom Eisner is a biologist, and he worked on moths. And he would go every year to Florida, and he would collect moths. And it turns out that two of the species of moths that he was dealing with were visually identical. But the males and the females of each species could find the other without any problem. And he thought, this is a problem. How do they recognize one? And so he collected a whole bunch of moths and went back to Cornell and asked a friend of his, who was a chemist, could he please figure out what the female moths had that enabled them to distinguish, that the males could distinguish between the two types of males. And because the chemist, who's a very smart man, said, no, we don't just test one, we test everybody. Realized that the males and the females both exuded pheromones, and Eisner creates chemical ecology. Chemistry is here, biology is here, and all of a sudden it's all different. Tom went in with the notion of seduction. The females had a perfume that they exuded in order to attract the males. What he very quickly realized was that his basis was very flawed, and there's a new basis, which now again, we're asking questions now about human pheromones, which was very much established when I was in Chicago, where they were first discovered. And now people are saying maybe not so good anymore. So that question of the fluidity, I'll open that to colleagues. The fluidity of science is important, not just in Kuhnian things. Amos.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I think it's a great question that you received, and I just wanted to add, I'll say it in a very kind of shorthand fashion, there is an intuition according to which if something is constructed, it is not true. But that's not the case. And I think I would actually say the same both about Jewish history and aspects of Jewish identity as well as science. So not only about science, but this is kind of a critical point.
Yeah, I would join in with Amos. I mean, I was thinking that if I was going to define science as something constructed, I don't know that truth is a question of construction, but construction in my mind in this case is about the kinds of questions that we ask and the methodologies that we employ. And they also reflect contemporary issues and needs. And so they are constructed from the standpoint that we have a particular perspective that we are bringing into the conversation and trying to address. That doesn't make it good, bad, or indifferent, but I think does sort of put it in the context of maybe what Kuhn said also about the notion of science being both traditional and revolutionary at the same time, and building even on the language and the findings of the past, even as it reorients them. So we construct everything in a certain way from a historical perspective, and so I don't think that takes away any of the majesty of the scientific disciplines if that's how we're thinking about them.
Julia?
Yes, I agree with the previous speakers, and I would say that, yeah, maybe I would put the emphasis here on the word fluid, as Sander has pointed out, in particularly if we're talking about the boundary between, again, sometimes perceived boundary between natural sciences and social sciences. Like it's only very, very recently, relatively, that social sciences themselves have kind of lost that order of objectivity. And in anthropology, again, it's sort of relatively recently that we started questioning the objectivity or the utilitarian value of social anthropology. So I would say yes, or would also agree with Mitch that if something is and Damas, that if something is constructed does not mean that there is no value in it, or that there is no kind of truth or no verisimilitude in it, to use Karl Popper's term.
Well, this is the claim of most people today, that what we're not talking about is hard constructivism. Yeah, it just made up, made up.
Yeah.
But certainly the people who were working in the 60s and 70s, on the social construction of science, rarely thought about it in terms of that sort of hard constructivism. I mean, Kuhn being the obvious case. Where the idea really is that science changes. Foucault's notion of rupture, right? I mean, is a question of change, right? It doesn't mean, total abandonment. It means the awareness that things change. What I wanted to claim, however, is that one of the reasons that geneticists in Mitch's audiences get PO'd is that they have a social capital in their disciplines on claims about verisimilitude and reality, which is how you get grant money. Right? No, and that's not, by the way, it's not a put down, that's the reality.
Yeah.
If I would go to a granting agency and say, maybe, nobody's going to give me a nickel for a maybe, right? They want to know how, what, and why.
Can I just add one thing?
Sure.
Which is, when I think about the whole notion of construction and science, I think in terms of the imposition of meaning. So I always begin my racial history classes by telling students, look, when we say that when race is constructed, we're not denying the existence of physical difference, for example. You'd be an idiot to say to students that physical difference doesn't exist. Look around. We're all physically different. There are different skin colors. There are different nasal sizes and shapes. But race is the imposition of a meaning on this sort of thing, and then hierarchies on top of that. And to get them to understand how something can be constructed is to, again, going back to what Sanders said, is to understand how humans impose meaning and then hierarchy, perhaps, on differences or similarities. That's how I think about it. The geneticists, nobody's denying the reality of the natural world. You'd have to be completely mad. But it's what you impose upon it and the meanings you give it. So that's my understanding of what we mean by construction, that for what it's worth.
Let me pick up something Mitch said earlier on and throw it out, which is, Mitch, you made a point that scientists and humanists don't often speak to one another, which I think is true. So the question is for the panelists, how would you go about integrating these essays and ideas about the relationship between Jews and science into a mainstream Jewish studies programs? Because as far as I know, most Jewish studies programs I've seen don't have serious scientific components to them.
I mean, I think that's a central question. I mean, one of the things that fascinated me about the rise of Israel studies, right, is that one of the questions that gets asked is whether or not Israel, as an entrepreneurial society, right, has a kind of a special status. Why are Jews better entrepreneurs than other people? Or are they, right? Or are they? And so it strikes me that, yeah, it has to do with the ability in courses to introduce questions. Now, I'm going to be brutal about it, which actually are the ones that university administrators are pushing, because they're pushing STEM right now. They're not pushing Jewish studies unless the Jewish studies is funded from outside of the universities, right? When the president of West Virginia University reduces his faculty, he doesn't reduce his STEM faculty, he reduces his humanities faculty. And if in point of fact we were asking the kind of questions that both the faculty and the students need to have asked, even within Jewish studies, maybe that becomes something that makes us even more valuable, not more valuable, but even.
Maybe if I could throw in a few suggestions here. One is that I think an opportunity to integrate science and other methodologies into a more traditional Jewish studies curriculum is if we start thinking about Jewish studies as addressing problems and issues rather than necessarily themes and chronologies.
Right.
So I know, for example, if colleagues at Arizona State University who work in a very interdisciplinary fashion, bringing scholars from different fields to solve issues. And I'm not sure that they all work necessarily, but I think that's a different dynamic where we are taking advantage of the different kind of methodological lenses, but towards a common goal that then becomes part of the work that we do. Another example I have in mind is years ago, I worked on a project at the University of Chicago called the Enhancing Life Project, where we brought together folks from very different fields to think about how do we create a field of enhancing life and how do we think about talking to each other. And I remember facilitating one of the conversations only to find that they were all using the same words, but meant completely different things by them. And so how do we create a shared vocabulary and a glossary where we can begin to have some opportunities to converse about things where we're saying the same things, or at least have a similar understanding. And sometimes I believe that means that we can confess that we're not going to be scientists. Mitch, you're not going to be a geneticist, but we know enough about genetics in order to engage that conversation or invite that sort of methodological and sort of perceptual lens as part of the conversation. That means something quite different. So I think part of it is how we focus the work that we do and how open we are to bringing this sort of true interdisciplinarity into the discussion, recognizing that science actually is also kind of fluid and expansive and covers a lot of issues that it's not just your chemistry and physics class, it's a whole lot of other ways of thinking about the scientific and natural worlds.
Julia.
Yeah, thank you. Just to take Steve's question in a slightly different direction, I'm based in what could be described an integrated anthropology department at Durham University, which means that we have both social and what they call in the UK biological anthropologists as well as medical anthropologists under the same roof. Yeah, and yes, I would say that we're a little bit of a rarity, at least in the UK, as bioanthropology in the UK, what people normally mean is just social anthropology, and that's it. So we're sometimes almost challenged and asked, so how does it work? So how do you have people coming from such different disciplinary and methodological perspectives work on similar issues? But we do try to do it in the department and at Durham more broadly, where interdisciplinarity is very much encouraged. And the way it is done is very much by adopting the approach that Dean has just mentioned. So we're trying to get people work on a big question, kind of trying to identify an issue and then approach that issue from a variety of disciplinary perspectives, from kind of natural sciences to arts and humanities and social sciences. And yes, it is a challenge. I'm not going to lie to you, but it's certainly a very interesting one.
Yeah.
Well, another question that I'm going to combine a few here, which is we know, I mentioned we know about Jewish studies and Jewish studies programs, but is there such a thing? Let's go right to the very core of this volume. Is there such a thing as Jewish science? And I want to cite some statistics here that I wrote in the foreword. From 1901 to 2021, Jews, either half or full, represent 22% of all Nobel Prize winners worldwide, 36% of all US Nobel Prize winners. Jews in physics, 26% of all Nobel Prize winners in physics are Jews, 38% in the United States, Jews. Jews in physiology and medicine, 26% of all worldwide Nobel Prize winners Jewish, In the United States, of those winners, 38% Jewish. And finally, in chemistry, 19% worldwide, 28% from the US. And finally, I just want to read something from one of our listeners today. How do you theorize the cultural category of Jews? I'm studying the Institut de Biologie Physico-Chimique in Paris during the 1920s and 30s. This was the leading center for the reductionist and materialist study of biology, the ancestry of molecular biology. The entire Department of Physiology, the main scientific department, comprised of people of Jewish descent, but none were practicing. So I go back to this question, is there such a thing, given these statistics, as Jewish science, or is it just scientists who happen to be Jews?
Dean.
So it is a fascinating question, and it's an unlikely source, but I recently happened to be reading something from Ismar Schorsch, and I want to share just the quote because I think it speaks to this question. He writes, Isidor Rabi, Austrian-born Nobel laureate in physics who taught at Columbia, used to attribute his success to his mother. He writes, when I came home from school, she would never ask me, what did you learn today? Only, Izzy, did you ask a good question? And so I'll leave it at that, but to suggest that I'm not sure that it's specifically a Jewish thing, but a sort of emphasis on dialogue and question asking and sort of tradition that maybe is helpful in thinking about our scientific advancement.
Amos?
Yeah, I was thinking that this is before our meeting today, that this is kind of, I think, a question which is in most of our minds. And for some reason, maybe I'm mistaken, but I think it's a question that till recently, it was even kind of, it was a delicate question, even to say it out loud was kind of I don't know, a bit suspicious. And I don't know if this is a question that can be, studied scientifically, but I do know that I was thinking about Benjamin Harshav's 2 volumes. One is called The Meaning of Yiddish, and the other is Language in Time of Revolution, where he does something which is actually quite close to what Dean gave as an example. He looks for the Jewish style of argumentation, and he tracks it back to certain kinds of communicative patterns which existed among Jews in East and Central Eastern Europe. And I don't know if this could serve as a kind of strategy, but this is the closest analogy that I can think of in terms of trying to turn this kind of delicate question into a subject of research in some way. I don't know if it's doable, but it could be a strategy.
Yeah. Okay, now I'm going to be very self-serving and mention the fact that a book I wrote many years ago called Smart Jews, the myth of Jewish superior intelligence, which is you damn well didn't want to be called smart the way that Jews were called smart. I will also point out to you that there's an interesting sociological phenomenon about academic disciplines, who gets into disciplines at what point, right? So that question about France is a very interesting one. And the fact that today, 2024, I think last time I looked, the number of self-identified Jews entering into the first year of medical schools in the United States and the UK is substantially lower than it was 30 years ago, while the number of South Asians and East Asians is substantially higher. Now, that may mean that the social capital associated with practicing medicine in the UK and the US has dropped substantially. It has. But I think one wants to ask very complicated questions then, and you raise this with Rabi, about who is Jewish, because the fantasy, and it is a fantasy, that the majority of Eastern European Jews who emigrated to Britain and the United States in the 19th and early 20th century were yeshiva bochers is exactly not the case. The majority were illiterate. Right? The majority were illiterate. You can see that in the records on Ellis Island. Right? And you can see the fact that the second and third generation were not easily admitted to universities, certainly in the United States after 1927. So I think one wants to ask much more complicated questions than this is an inheritance of the smart Jews of Eastern Europe who were questioning everything. My grandfather, who was a saddler and a horsemonger in Poland, right, could not read or write. My father could read or write. He couldn't go to the university because of the Depression and because of quotas. His grandson is a smart Jew.
Can I just
Sandro,
add? Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. Almost.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
I just wanted to say that I think at least some of what you said actually amplifies the statistics that that Steve mentioned. It doesn't make the question go away.
No, not at all. Not at all. In fact, one of the questions one asks is, do you have to, I mean, women know this, and African Americans know this in the United States, right? And BAM people in the UK know that you have to be better if you want to compete in societies which don't admit you, right? And, one of the fascinating things about medicine is that Jews get admitted to medical specialties in Europe and North America based on the low status of the specialty. So that the first university professor in a medical faculty who's a Jew is a professor of dermatology, right?
I just want to add, I just got in the chat box, I think a very good point of those Eastern Europeans who are coming over may have been illiterate, but they were really smart and they did very well for themselves. And I can tell you this too, if we're looking at, is there a Jewish science? In my own research right now, I'm looking at post-war America, both white supremacy and anti-Semitism. And I can tell you the Anti-Defamation League and the American Jewish Committee after World War II, the single biggest issue both of them were focusing on were discrimination in higher education against Jews, of trying to stop, quote, Jewish science, trying to stop Jewish academics, period, by the quota system. And more than any other issue that I can see in the immediate post-war era was opening university to Jews. They've just fought in a war. Some of them have just come back from the war. And the least we can do is give them access to higher education.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And by the way, the quotas exist well into the late 60s in the United States, right? Wow. Yale gets rid of the Jewish quotas. I'm going to say 68. I'm happy to quibble about a year or two.
Well, I can tell you.
Can I just add one thing, Steve? This phrase Jewish science is extraordinarily problematic.
Yes.
I'd be very careful invoking that because the only people who really spoke about Jewish science were the Nazis and the anti-Semites. Yeah. So the most famous example is, of course, Einsteinian physics was described as a Jewish science and was bizarrely for a while contrasted in the 1930s and 40s in Germany with Aryan science. And the French and the Germans had French. So these were nationalized and racialized categories. And Jewish science, that phrase is deeply, deeply problematic. And it's a different thing from what you seem to be asking, which was, why might there be a preponderance of Jews in the sciences or Nobel Prize winners? That's a different question. And I would suggest, in addition to Sanders' work, take a look at Shulamit Volkov, the extraordinary German Israeli historian who spoke, as Sanders said, very convincing sociological explanations for this, right? I mean, this is a very old question that Thorsten Veblen is already asking at the turn of the century. It goes way back why are Jews successful in intellectual disciplines?
Yeah.
There's,
And,
okay,
and by the way, the person who is the spokesperson for German physics, for Aryan physics, is the Nobel Prize winner in physics.
right. And again, it has to do with marginality, as Sandra was saying. They are what I consider a very convincing argument is that Jews can enter in at certain points into professions and disciplines that are not considered to be central to national identities, right? Which is why English departments for so long were hostile to Jews.
Yes.
And especially, I mean, even to the recently, Stephen Greenblatt accused in the UK of being this Jewish interloper and trying to take from good English professors the discipline of Shakespeare, or this sort of thing, that if something's key to a national identity, then it's central, and Jews can move to the margins. So anthropology and sociology was okay, or psychoanalysis, when these were starting out as disreputable or slightly reputable disciplines. But history and history and literature, these are too important to the nation to be given over to these people. So there are sociological explanations and historical for this,
Mitch, I
rather
like what
than
you're saying is,
biological ones.
yeah, if we particularly take those more fluid kinds of disciplines and fluid work, the liminality of Jews in many cases actually aligns really nicely with they're in a position to be more operative in those fluid environments based on that kind of liminal experience and liminal position. So it's an interesting question to explore.
Very.
So we've got our next book planned. Right? Jews and liminality.
Oh my God.
It's on the margins, but it's good.
I want to thank our panel for a really interesting discussion today. And by the way, I want to be clear. The question of, is there such a thing as Jewish science, was one posed by our audience. And I think it is a legitimate question to ask. And I think you have also said, Mitch, why it is a dangerous question to ask in many ways. Again, I urge our audience to take a look at these essays. They're quite remarkable. Yes, just go to Purdue University Press. You'll find it there. Type in Kasdan Annual. In addition to thanking our panelists, I want to thank our audience for tuning in today. If this is the first time, please get on our mailing list. And we want to invite you to, in the age of online presentation, our next event is actually going to be live. And we want to invite our panelists, if you want to fly out to LA on March 17th at Sinai Temple, which is Wilshire and Beverly Glen. We're going to have our Burton Lewis lecture, which is going to feature a panel comprised of several highly prominent Iranian Jewish authors and scholars on the topic, Weaving the Tapestry of Ancestry and Modernity, the Next Generation of Iranian Jewish Women in Literature and Academia. So thank you, all our panelists today. Thank you, our audience. And I particularly want to thank Brenda Mendoza and our tech team today for doing, once again, a wonderful job of presenting this very interesting panel to all of you. I wish all of you a relaxing, enjoyable, and hopefully sunny Sunday afternoon and evening. Thank you all for being here. Good night.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.